Pauline Epistles in the language of the Caucasian Albanians.
Can I put it to Thank you. Thank you very much to the organisers of the conference for this great occasion in Birmingham. It's lovely to see you all, even the intimidating back row. Because my subject deals a little bit with Armenian studies, I have a quote from an eminent Armenian scholar to start with. I won't read it, I'll just let you read it. And then he says 15 minutes, but I think I can go for 20 or for 17 at least, according to the timer. You can tell me at the end of 17 minutes which of these approaches you think I followed. I want to start by saying 6 years ago at this colloquium, I think it was the 11th Birmingham Colloquium, I had the pleasure of introducing colleagues to biblical texts in Caucasian Albanian. It was the theme of that colloquium was the Gospel of John. So I presented the Caucasian Albanian text of John there. Today I'm looking at the second corpus of Caucasian Albanian biblical texts, known as the Lectionary manuscript, and specifically the readings from the works of the Apostle Paul. Before I turn to today's topic, though, I should briefly recapitulate the background to these fascinating texts, with apologies to anyone who still remembers my 2019 presentation, from which I'm quoting. Following a fire in November 1971 in part of the Monastery of St Catherine in Sinai, a program of remedial works was undertaken, during which an opening was found in the area below the Chapel of St George in the northern wall of the monastery. And now I'm quoting from the New Finds of Sinai volume. In the afternoon of May the 25th, 1975, the Skevophylaks of the monastery, Archimandrit Sophronios, responsible for the cleaning project, saw a small piece of parchment in the earth removed by the Bedouin workers from the inner area. This discovery led to the excavation of a walled-out chamber, which turned out eventually to contain more than 1,000 manuscripts, ranging from fragments to complete codices, a collection known as the New Finds of Sinai. Of course, not quite so new now, but the majority of the manuscripts discovered, naturally enough, were in Greek. And the most sensational among these finds was, of course, the discovery of 12 previously unknown folia of the Codex Sinaiticus. However, there were also manuscripts in a variety of other languages, including Arabic, Armenian, Ethiopic, Georgian, Hebrew, Latin, Slavonic, and Syrian. The Georgian manuscripts are a particularly interesting case for two reasons. First, they were in the beginning wrongly supposed to be Armenian, and their definitive identification had to wait until a visit to the monastery by the Patriarch of the Georgian Church in 1984. Secondly, some of these Georgian manuscripts were found to be palimpsests, and in the case of two of them, Sin Geo N13 and N55, the lower layer of writing appeared to be in an unknown language and script. The story of the identification of this language and script is a long and interesting one, extending through several expeditions to Sinai by scholars from the Georgian Academy of Sciences, together with specialists in Caucasian linguistics from Germany and Austria. It turned out that the lower layer of Sin Geo N13 and N55 is written in the language of the Caucasian Albanians, an ancient people of the Northeast Caucasus, whose language and script were previously only known from fragmentary inscriptions and references mainly in Armenian historical sources. So the lower layer of writing for the palimpsest was still quite difficult to read, but now there are better images, and I apologize for not taking these from the site of the Sinai palimpsest project, where they use newer technology to read the lower layer. We should note in passing that the ethnonym Albanian has an entirely different origin from that of the Albanians of southern Europe. It's most likely derived from the Armenian designation of this people as Alwan. A descendant of their language has survived under the name Udi, a language spoken today by a few hundred people in a couple of isolated villages in the mountains of northern Georgia and southern Georgia and northern Azerbaijan. Closer to the subject of our colloquium, the text of these palimpsests, once it had been deciphered, turned out to be a translation of parts of the New Testament, with a couple of short passages from Isaiah and Psalms, a lectionary with readings from several New Testament books, and a continuous text of the Gospel of John. The existence of a Caucasian Albanian translation of the scriptures had long been suspected. The references in Armenian sources even led to a page on Caucasian Albanian in Bruce Metzger's survey volume on early versions of the New Testament. But here was the most dramatic confirmation of the existence of this translation. Suddenly, specialists in Caucasian languages had access to a substantial corpus in an ancient language hitherto considered lost, and biblical scholars had at their disposal texts in the newly discovered ancient version. What would be the impact of this discovery on the textual criticism of the New Testament? In our quest to answer that question, we are fortunate to have at our disposal an exemplary edition of the Caucasian Albanian palimpsests. Using this edition, the aim of my presentation today is to examine the readings of potential text critical interest in the letters of St. Paul, collections from the letters of St. Paul. But just a couple of words about this edition first. You don't get from the slide any sense of how enormous these books are. They're about this size. They're very huge. And yeah, that's the and you get in these books you get everything you need for a study of Caucasian Albanian material. You get a historical introduction, get a detailed codicological description of the manuscripts, so I won't repeat that here. You get grammar of the Caucasian Albanian language. You get two editions of the texts, an editio minor with a simplified transliteration and what the editors call a close English translation. You get loads of indexes and glossaries. You get an index of all the Caucasian Albanian words, all of their occurrences, the scriptural references, the place in the manuscripts. You get indexes of Albanian Georgian, Albanian Armenian, Albanian Syriac, English Albanian, and indexes of different kinds. And then in the second volume, you get the editio maior. So you get photographs on the left-hand page of the manuscript. You get the transcription on the right-hand page, and then across the bottom, you get reference versions in a large number of languages. So I have to be honest and say I'm not making any huge original contribution in today's session. I'm relying on this excellent edition, and I haven't gone back to the manuscripts, even on now that they're on the site of the Sinai palimpsest project. It would be a very worthwhile thing to do, of course, but quite a difficult thing to do. They have 10 or 12 images of each page of the manuscript. The way they do the photographing now is to use all kinds of different technologies in order to recover the lower layer. So it's quite time-consuming to work with. And anyway, the editors of this 2008 edition are promising an updated edition of their own based on reading the new materials, and they will, of course, do a better job than I could. Yeah, so I want to look at readings of potential text critical interest in the lections from Paul. As I mentioned, the second of these two palimpsest manuscripts was designated by the editors a lectionary manuscript. containing a small number of readings from the Synoptic Gospels, together with a much larger number of readings from the Apostolos. As we would expect from a palimpsest manuscript dismembered and reused for other purposes, the extant texts are scattered in a complex fashion among the existing leaves of the two manuscripts. And of course, we have no way of knowing what additional readings might have formed part of the original work. But is this, in fact, a lectionary? The editors of the palimpsests offer a summary comparison of each reading with the standard editions of the Armenian and Georgian, primary representatives of the Jerusalemite lectionary tradition. But this serves mainly to indicate the discrepancies among these sources. This matter was studied in more detail by the renowned liturgical scholar Charles Renou, and for the readings from St. Paul in particular, he advances a theory that the Caucasian Albanian material can hardly constitute a lectionary as such, since the normal rubrics indicating the place of the readings in the liturgical calendar are almost entirely absent. There are rubrics, but essentially they just say a reading from the Apostle Paul's letter to the Ephesians or whatever, and occasionally notes that say for the martyrs, for the saints, for the churches, but no calendar indications at all. So not like the Armenian and Georgian lectionaries in that respect. Renou says that instead, the compiler of the texts that have come down to us may well have had or must have had an actual Albanian lectionary at hand, but has put together this particular collection of Pauline readings for a different purpose, which is now difficult to retrieve. But he considers that they constitute a kind of testimonia collection or florilegium with a Christological purpose. And he says that in the biblical passages he puts together, and he's referring to the lections from St. Paul in this case, the compiler of the collection indeed draws a comprehensive image of the Word made flesh. I'll let you read this. I won't read it to you in case it appears that I'm preaching a sermon. You can read this. But his argument is that this is pulled out of an actual Albanian lectionary for a Christological purpose, either for a missionary purpose, for a church under pressure in an Islamic environment, or for a pedagogical purpose within the church. But he sees it within the context of the Christological debates in the immediate post-Chalcedonian period, bearing in mind the 5th century date from the Jerusalem lectionaries and the Caucasian Albanian lectionary apparently and presumably deriving from that tradition. So turning now to the texts from the Pauline Epistles. For today's presentation, I've used the material provided by the 53 editorial notes on Paul from the edition. And as I said, I didn't go back to the manuscripts in the interest of full disclosure. I say it again. After a first stage of tracking down the tiny superscript footnote callers on these huge pages of the Editio Maio, I classified the notes into these categories. Albanian language and spelling, issues of reconstruction of the missing texts. The editors are very bold in their textual reconstructions. Parallels with the Armenian version, questions of translation, potential text critical issues, and residual miscellaneous category. Of course, it's not always easy to distinguish between text critical and translation matters. Here are a couple of examples where it seems we are dealing with issues of translation rather than text. Actually, looking at the clock, I'm not going to be able to go through these slides because I do want to come to the text critical slides. But the Romans 8:37 example, you could argue both ways. You could argue this is a matter of translation, that these languages just like to use images based on hand to translate via. Or you could argue actually, as the editors of the edition do, this is an example of Syriac influence on the edition. The other example, I think, is more obvious. It's just assimilation to earlier in the verse. And of course, many examples from the parallels with Armenian version category deal with textual matters. I left these out today, but partly for time and partly because they simply confirm that the Albanian version derives from an Armenian version of some kind, probably earlier than the ones that we have in our editions today. Just before I come to the text critical matters, I had in mind, but probably won't do this either, I wanted to look at just a couple of miscellaneous points of interest. This one from Romans 12:2 just indicates that there are signs of editorial work on the manuscript. What I put here is the transcription, because you can't read it properly on the photo of the manuscript, but it shows erasing the four letters. For some reason, the original scribe repeated twice yo, yo, and then it was deleted, and then inserting was in between the lines because it had been omitted. So evidence of editorial work, and the editors say also a possible link with the Euthalian apparatus, which I don't want to mismention, although I'm a little bit skeptical about it. They say there's one of the marginal notes, which you can just see on the photo of the manuscript, is stichometric note about the 50th verse. Of course, this stichometry is by no means unique to the Euthalian apparatus, but it's kind of interesting because the Euthalian apparatus is so well known in Armenian and Georgian, so maybe it's something to do with the Caucasian areal with this. So now I turn to the finally the cases of, and I'm supposed to stop now and leave time for questions, but I'll run quickly through these text critical cases, because this is probably what you paid your money to come and hear. I start with 1 Corinthians 12:28. I won't read this, partly not to bore you with my Demotic pronunciation, but partly because it's just to do with an addition at the end of the verse. The editor's notes refer to the addition of the verse of translation of tongues, which it says only found in Albanian and Armenian. Actually, according to the Center for New Testament Textual Studies apparatus, they cite 2 Greek manuscripts for the addition of Armenian or so for this verse. Then in 1 Corinthians, the next verse, 1 Corinthians 12:29, is to do with the order of apostoli and prophete. Nothing in the CNTTS apparatus. It's not a text in the text and text verb volume. Is it a translation or textualism? You find these different orders in other places also, like in 1 Thessalonians 2:9, Albanian day and night for Niktos Kaineros. Then 1 Corinthians 15:55. This is a more complicated example because there are 2 textual issues: the order of Nikos and Kendron on the one hand, and the attestation of Ali versus Thanate on the other. Both of these are to be explained according to Hugh Houghton's new textual commentary by assimilation to the Septuagint, and thanks to Hugh for sharing that paragraph with me. The Armenian and Albanian follow the pattern of Nikos Kendron order and Ave non Thanate, whereas Georgian follows the standard Byzantine, which you don't have in the apparatus unit for UBS 6. You have it still in UBS 5. As a textual scholar, I understand the omission of Armenian and Georgian in UBS 6. As a specialist in Caucasian languages, I deeply regret it. This example from 2 Corinthians 5:8 is to do with Kyrion versus Theon at the end of the verse. Zophar gives a footnote in the edition for Lord as a variant for God, and the Georgian is unequivocally has Lord Son. Once again, the CNTTS apparatus gives a couple of citations for Theon for this verse, and probably there will be more in UCM. I'll just flick through these because I want to give a few moments of question. I'll just let you read these off the screen and perhaps just take the last one. Again, you see, I've selected readings where there is some evidence of attestation in the Greek manuscript tradition. Sometimes not, however. This one in Ephesians, it's one that you could, I suppose, argue as a textual variant, but I would say much more likely stylistic assimilation to the imas earlier in the verse. So a translation rather than the textual issue, and maybe the same for this one in 1 Timothy 2:1. In the list of 4. Theis proseuchas, interstices, and eucharistias. The third one, the interstices, is missing only in the Albanian, and it's not that likely to be a textual hapax in Albanian. I think it's more likely to be a transmission. And lastly, very lastly, about the faithful high priest, Pistos Archieres. The Albanian lacks any equivalent for Pistos, whereas in Armenian you have Pauline, and in Georgian you have Saxonon. The Albanian says, so that he might be merciful and a high priest, according to the editor's translation. Again, could it be a textual hapax in Armenian? Probably not. Probably an omission. So I have to say that, unfortunately, the results of this study are rather meager as regards to Greek text. Maybe out of those 8 cases, there are 2 or 3 where the attestation in the Greek manuscript tradition is interesting and or convincing. But I hope it does show the interest and the importance of the Albanian version for the history of the New Testament text in the Caucasus. I don't want to finish without thanking my students, Samuel Pogosyan and Nana Sarvishvili, for their help with the Armenian and Georgian version respectively. And to say to all of you, if I have at all piqued your interest in matters Caucasian Albanian, there is this wonderful open access volume published by the college. Actually, it's not that much use to putting this up on screen. If you just search the de Groote site on Caucasian Albanian, you come to a free 700-page status question in this volume. Thank you for your attention, and sorry for the interruption.
Our next speaker will be Kurt Nicka, Lacuna Matata, Gaps in the Ethiopic Tradition, Transmission, History